So we've got a question here from Sophia asking, I always finish logical reasoning late because I double check the easy ones like 5 times. I know it wastes time, but I'm terrified of missing a dumb mistake. How do you actually build overconfidence so you can stop overthinking? Now, one of the sneakiest score killers on the LSAT is second guessing yourself. You know that feeling when you finish a section and suddenly you think, wait, did I read that right? So you go back, reread it, change your answer, and of course, it turns out that your first answer was correct. That right there is the silent score killer. And it usually shows up in students who care a lot. They want to be perfect, they double check the easy questions, but then they run out of time on the hard ones. Not because they're bad at logic, but because they don't trust themselves. Now, here's what I want you to take away. Confidence is not an innate personality trait. It is a test-taking skill, and you can train it the same way you train speed and endurance. Now, confidence might feel risky because it means letting go of control. And if you've been studying for months, you think, if I don't check my work, what if I make a dumb mistake? And that fear makes sense, but it's also costing you points. Because on the LSAT, the clock punishes hesitation harder than it punishes a few mistakes. I'm going to say that again. Indecision costs more than inaccuracy. You can recover from 1 or 2 careless errors, but you can't recover from running out of time on 5 questions that you never even saw. So confidence is not about arrogance. It's about strategic trust. It's saying, I know what I'm doing at least enough to move forward. And you might think the difference between a 160 and a 170 is intelligence or study hours, but it's about flow. 170 scores move and commit. They're not faster because they're smarter, they're faster because they stop arguing with themselves. Now, one of the patterns we see with our students again and again is that the higher scorers make decisions with less hesitation. They've trained their instincts through review, and they've built evidence that their gut instinct is usually right. And because of that, they trust it. It's data-driven confidence. They've seen enough moments where their first choice was right to stop changing their answers unless they have an actual reason. Now, there's this funny thing that happens to advanced students where they get bored on the easy questions, so they second guess themselves just to feel busy. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I knew the first 10 were easy, but I rechecked them just to be sure. That's like rereading the ingredients on a granola bar wrapper while the timer is ticking on a bomb. It makes you feel safe, but it's the worst possible use of time. Now, the first 10 questions in logical reasoning are specifically designed to separate those below 150 from those above 150. So if you're aiming for a 170 or above, those are probably going to feel easy, and that's by design. So when those questions feel simple, that's not a reason for you to panic. That's just what doing it right feels like, because the hard stuff is going to come later. Your job here is to bank time on the easier questions. Get through them efficiently, confidently, and without second guessing. That extra time is what lets you slow down and think clearly when the real curveballs show up later in this section. Now, confidence comes from proof ultimately. So if you want to get better at trusting your gut, you want to start tracking when it's actually right. Here is an exercise we give students. Every time you change an answer, mark it with a star. Then later when you review, check if your first instinct or your revision was correct. If your first choice wins 70% of the time, which it usually does, you just gathered hard evidence that your intuition is reliable after all. And that's how you rewire your brain to stop second guessing. And if you notice that your second choices are right more often, that's useful data too. It means your internal reasoning process is still developing, and that's something we can strengthen through review. Now, confidence is built every time you sit down for a timed section. If you practice like a nervous student where you're pausing, double checking, and hesitating, you're going to perform like a nervous student. But if you practice like a decisive test taker where you're moving quickly, trusting your training, and reviewing later, that's exactly how you'll show up on test day. When we work with students, we call this test day simulation. It's not just about the questions, it's about the mindset. Every practice section should feel like the real thing. The timer starts, and once you make a decision, you move on. You can analyze all you want in review, but during the section, you are focused. Now, confidence isn't about saying I'm the best, it's about saying I've done the work and I trust what I've built. And when you're new to the LSAT, of course, you're going to doubt yourself, and that's normal. But as you study, review, and see the same patterns again and again, you earn the right to be confident. So when you get to a question and your brain says, wait, what if I'm wrong? You can calmly respond, I might be, but I've trained for this. That's the real power of confidence. It's quiet, steady, and earned through thousands of reps. And when you have that, when you've put in the hours and you've learned to trust your gut, you're going to move through the LSAT a whole lot easier because you stopped fighting yourself. Now, I've got a question here from Ethan saying, everyone online keeps saying the newer LSATs are harder than the old ones, like they're trickier or more random. I feel like I'm doomed because I've been practicing with older tests. Is that true? Now, every year I hear the same thing from students saying the newer LSATs are way harder, they're trickier, and the old ones were easier. I wish I was able to take those. And every year I've got to say, stop psyching yourself out. The harder LSAT myth is one of the biggest confidence killers out there. It convinces students that the LSAT has changed in some mysterious, unbeatable way, when really, the only thing that's changed is how nervous they feel about it. And yeah, the LSAT changes a little bit over time. But here's the thing. The core logic remains the same. The language might get tighter, the writing style might be a bit more modern, and some question types change, but you're still being tested on reasoning. You're still being asked to find flaws, strengthen arguments, and ID assumptions. And the bones of the test, in other words, haven't changed in decades. And sometimes I'll have students solve an older question and a newer one side by side, and students can't even tell the difference. They're both built on the same exact patterns, just wrapped in slightly different outfits. So when students say the newer LSATs feel harder, what they're usually feeling is pressure, because by the time you get to the newer tests, you've been studying for a while. You've used the earlier ones as practice, you've read the Reddit horror stories. So when you open a fresh test, your brain's already whispering to you, this is the hard one that everybody's talking about. And when you expect something to feel hard, it is feeling hard. That's confirmation bias in action. You start reading slower, second guessing yourself, and suddenly the test feels harder because your mindset has changed. I've seen students score lower on a new exam just because they expected it to be harder. Then they redo the same questions a week later, relaxed, and their score goes up 5 points. Same test, same brain, different energy. Now, another reason people say it's harder now is because test takers on average are more prepared than they used to be. So the curve has gotten harder. The competition has improved. So when you compare raw score conversions over time, it can look like the test is harder, but in reality, everyone else just got better. Now, a pattern I've seen hundreds of times is when a student does well on the older exams and they move on to the more recent ones and their confidence tanks. So they think, I must be getting worse, but they're not. They're actually moving up to the top of the difficulty curve where the margin for error shrinks. Earlier in your prep, you might improve 10 points just by learning the basics. But later, when you're fighting for a 170 and above, you might fight for a single point here or there, so every tiny mistake feels huge. That's what makes these newer tests feel harder. You're playing at a higher level now. And so when we work with students at this phase, we reframe it like strength training. At the start, you could make huge gains even using light weights, but later, you've got to increase the resistance slowly and deliberately, and that feels uncomfortable. So here's what you want to do instead of obsessing about difficulty. First, mix it up. Don't save all the newer exams for the end. Sprinkle them throughout your prep. Secondly, review for structure. Ask, what is the underlying logic here? Is it the same as an older question type I already know? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes. Third, don't chase perfect scores on new material. Focus on the process, not perfection. And finally, take confidence from your past success. You've already proven you can handle the tough questions. Don't throw that away just because the new test format looks different in some way. So the truth is, ultimately, the LSAT isn't getting harder, you're getting better. And as you get better, you start noticing subtler mistakes, trickier traps, and smaller timing issues. And that's progress. When you were a beginner, you missed the big obvious stuff, but now you're fine tuning perfection and precision. It just feels harder because your standards are higher. And that's exactly what improvement looks like. So stop feeding the myth that the LSAT is somehow harder now. You're just leveling up. And once you see it that way, as a sign of growth, you start realizing that every new scary test is really just another chance to prove how far you've come.